Hi, I'm Frank Cho. Welcome back to my channel. And I'm right at the park and ride of Lawrenceville, Pennsylvania. Right. So anyway, I've not done a video for quite a while. So we're right in the middle of winter today, and it's pretty relatively sunny and warm, and relatively as in probably about uh, 35, 36 degrees Fahrenheit, or 1 or 2 degrees Celsius, right? So it's actually considered warm for this time of the year, right? At least for today. It's gonna get cold for the next few days. Anyway, what I'm gonna do today is that I decided to try something different. Rather than talk from my office in my home, I thought I'll do it outdoors and discuss about a topic that is quite familiar to most Singaporeans, right? Now, the reason why I decided to do on this topic is just to break from the usual pattern of doing kind of travelogue around the area where I live, right? And since this topic I'm very familiar with, and I've done a fair bit of analysis and research on it, right? And this is about the Sarong Party Girl, all right? The Sarong Party Girl, all right? Before anything else, all right, I'm sure all of you know what is a Sarong Party Girl. Sarong, as in it means the wrap around the waist itself, right? It basically means a local Asian girl itself, right? Without going to the definitions of what is a Sarong Party Girl, since most of you know what it is, right? I like to pose this question: where did the Sarong Party Girl basically originate, right? So this is where I'm gonna give you sort of like the origins of the Sarong Party Girl, how they basically evolved to what it is today, and its relevancy in the Singapore culture in the modern times, right? Now, before anything else, we have to talk about the concept of Orientalism itself. Okay, what is Orientalism, right? Now, the word Orient itself is just an old-fashioned term to mean the East, right? The East itself. So you have Orientals, that means Easterners, and some of you may not be aware that this is another word that most people are not aware of, right? Westerners are often called Occident, or Occident, right? Occident itself. Occidental Westerners, right? And Oriental would be Easterners, right? So we are more familiar with Orient because it's more commonly used, at least for a certain period of time. Now, in 1978, a Columbia University professor by the name of Edward Said, right, wrote a kind of very important cultural analysis book about the concept of Orientalism itself, right? This book became a sort of a well-known non-fiction bestseller that's often read in college classrooms, especially at the graduate level. Itself, it basically breaks down the a kind of a cultural concept that he argues that has been used to subvert or culturally dominate Easterners or Middle Easterners, right? Now, you must remember when Edward Said wrote this book in 1978, right? He was really focusing on the Middle East, right? It's still part of the Orient, but the Middle East, that means where we know as the Arab countries or Iraq, Iran, Egypt itself and all that, right? So that's where you have the Middle East, because it's the midpoint to the Far East, which is what? East Asia, China, Japan and Korea, okay? Now, this book itself, right, basically discuss how the Western audience, I wouldn't say the Western audience, But Western writers, historians, critics, literary luminaries, right, have sort of made the Orient very exotic to the way they perceive it. Anyway, where was I? I just walked next to the creek itself. All right, like I say, it's quite a pretty day, and you can see the sun glistening on the surface of the waters itself. So, but anyway, coming back to Orientalism itself. Now, so basically, Edward Said's argument is that much of the cultural perception by Westerners towards the East, or at least in the Middle East in this case, right, are often a means of viewing through the lens of sort of categorizing or stereotyping, right, the Orient as being exotic, very sexual, and the bottom line is that itself that it's not a culture or a civilization that is equal to the West, right? And most of the time, this may not be intentional, right? This may not be intentional. It's not to say that Westerners intentionally try to dehumanize the Orient itself, right? But through their sort of sometimes inherent cultural biases itself, right? This occurred itself, right? Now, evidence of this could be found in things such as what? For instance, when you talk about words such as harem, right? When you talk about, the word harem itself, that means having, what do you call this, sexual, very sexual women to the whims of men itself. There's a kind of a depiction of, the pre-Islamic, right? The pre-Islamic Middle East or the Arab world, right? Engages or at least indulges or even indulges in this concept of a harem for rich, powerful people. Okay, and then another example about Orientalism itself could also be seen. For example, although India is not part of the Middle East, but it definitely is Asia. It's Asia itself, right? One of the common stereotypes of Indian culture, right? Or when even people from the West, when they think of India, right? One of India's traditional literature, right, is the what? Kama Sutra, right? Which is basically sort of a sexual methods book itself, right? Right? A book that is about sexuality itself. Again, this is a common theme that you see whereby the East itself or the Orient is often seen through the lenses of sexuality, where it's very sexual, where the women are often seen as sexual beings, right? And it is a society or a culture where it definitely is much more carnal and less progressive or even civilized as the Western world, right? So anyway, this book by Edward Said has become a very important text in cultural studies, and it basically brings a very fresh argument and perspective to this perception or misperception of the East by the West, okay, of the East by the West. All right, now that you know the basic precepts of Orientalism itself, right? Now let's see how Orientalism itself eventually relates back to the Singapore Sarong Party Girl. All right. Now you know where I'm getting itself, right? Okay. Now, before we even go there, right? Let's see, where did the Sarong Party Girl basically originate? All right. Okay. Now let's talk about go back to Orientalism itself. Orientalism itself later could be transferred or even applied to the Far East, even though when the book was originally written, it was meant for the Middle East, right? The Mid-Orient itself. But you can see most of Edward Said's ideas can be applied to the Far East, or even Southeast Asia, or other parts of the non-Western world. Okay, now let me say something about Edward Said itself. He's quite an interesting person. He's a Columbia University professor, right? And I think he's already passed away. He passed at a pretty young age, I believe, before he even was maybe around 50 or whatever. I gotta check out. But in any case, his book was a very important watershed book itself that explains this cultural misperception of the East itself. All right. Now, coming back to Orientalism as applies to the 20th century. Now, this book was written in 1978. 1978 itself. Now, even though Edward Said didn't talk about this, but I can see where Orientalism itself also exists in the movie culture or popular culture, as can be evidenced by some of these examples that I'm gonna say. Right now, in 1898, there was a very famous book or short story called Madame Butterfly that's been adapted into a movie, and it became very well known as an opera, right? An opera itself in the early 1900s, right? The whole story itself is basically about an American who has a romantic but tragic love affair with a Japanese geisha girl sometime in the late 1800s, right? In the late 1800s itself. So anyway, you can see this is a very famous story that will be repeated again in various forms throughout the 20th century. In the 1940s and 50s, right? The famous American novelist James Michener, right? Some of you may be familiar with some of his later works, right? But he was already quite a well-known writer, right? He wrote, dozens of books, right? But two examples where Orientalism itself exists could be seen in this famous novel that was published in 1954 called Sayonara. It was later also reproduced as a movie starring Marlon Brando itself. Now, what was Sayonara about? Again, is about American, I believe he's an officer, right? During the World War II era, where he basically during the post-World War II era, where America occupies Japan, where he has again a romantic love liaisons with a Japanese woman, right? But anyway, this story itself is actually quite tragic because I believe the protagonist, the American officer, right, and the woman that he's in love with eventually committed suicide in the end, right? So it's kind of tragic love story, okay? So that is based on the book and also the movie Sayonara. Now, also later on we have, or even earlier, I believe in 1947, James Michener also wrote a book called Tales of the South Pacific, Tales of the South Pacific itself. Now, eventually it became the South Pacific, which was a very popular musical, right? It was adapted into a musical which became very popular in the late 1940s and also in the 1950s, right? 1950s itself, right? And it also became not just a very popular musical, but it also became a very popular movie of the same title called The South Pacific, right? So anyway, whether it's a musical or a movie itself, right? It basically was inspired by a book called Tales of the South Pacific by James Michener, right? In any case, right, the plot itself involves, among other things, right, there is also a subplot, a major subplot in the story of South Pacific where an American Marine fell in love with a Polynesian woman, right? Polynesian woman itself, or to be more specific, a Tonkinese woman itself, right? Some of you may be old enough to have seen the movie South Pacific, and you will remember that there was a very beautiful American Asian actress, right, by the name of France Nguyen, who plays this Tonkinese or Polynesian woman. France Nguyen itself, right, I believe she's still around today. She's probably about 86 in the 80s itself, and you may remember in more recent movies like the Joy Luck Club, right? The very popular Joy Luck Club movie in the 1990s, right? Which she played as one of the four mothers, right? France Nguyen played as one of the four mothers in the four stories itself, right? Obviously by the 1990s, she was a sort of middle-aged woman by then, right? Middle-aged woman by then. Okay, so anyway, you see, there's another example of a story whereby it involves a Westerner, right, falling in love with a native Asian woman. In this case, a Polynesian or Tonkinese woman itself. Okay. Now, another example of this Orientalist trajectory, the world of Susie Wong. Right? I believe the world of Susie Wong starred the American actor William Holden and a very beautiful Nancy Kwan. Now, Nancy Kwan herself, right? Nancy Kwan herself, right, became the object of this of the Asian woman in Hong Kong who fell with this, I believe, American businessman of sorts, right? In Hong Kong itself. Again, it's another example of Orientalism, whereby you see a Westerner, right, having a romantic relationship with a native woman. In this case, it was set in Hong Kong, the world of Susie Wong, right? Nancy Kwan, who was really at her peak in her acting career, professional acting career, right? Went on to act in a lot of other movies too, right? Right? Incidentally, she's also another example of a kind of an exotic, beautiful-looking American Asian, right? No different from France Nguyen, right? I believe both of them are the same age today, right? Because I was checking on their biography. Both France Nguyen and Nancy Kwan are about the same age. I believe they were born the same year. They were born the same year itself. So in any case, right, that's another example, right? But a more recent, coming back towards more modern times, right? You have a famous musical that was produced in 1999, first a Broadway musical, right? That was first released in London in 1989. That was Miss Saigon, right? Miss Saigon itself, to put it in a nutshell, is just sayonara set in Vietnam, right? During the Vietnam War itself, right? So you're talking about this time between, again, an American serviceman and a native Vietnamese woman, right? Again, a musical that has a tragic implications, right? So all I'm saying in all these examples is that you can see a kind of a standard relationship whereby a Western man falls in love with a local native woman, and at least the story, in most of the cases, it was hoped that the woman can eventually leave with the Western serviceman and go back to his native country and have a better life, right? Have a better life. All right, so that's the basic synopsis of most of the basic synopsis of the plots of most of these stories, right? Now, whether it end up on a happy note or a sad note, that's immaterial. But the idea is that it's always a Western man who comes to sort of rescue an Asian woman to have a better life in the Western man's world. Okay, so now let me say, so you can see where this transposed to Orientalism itself as good examples of Orientalism, because in this case, the woman, to a certain extent, was sexualized too, right, as an object to be rescued by the Western man. All right, now this brings us back to the Singapore Sarong Party Girl, right, and this is where I try to basically link how the Sarong Party Girl basically originated. You can see it comes from an earlier Western perception in which the Singapore Sarong Party Girl is sort of an extension to that that storyline itself. Okay, now was the Sarong Party Girl around even at an earlier time, let's say in the early 1900s or even in the 1800s itself, right? Probably it was already around, but the Sarong Party Girl itself, which basically is something that's more associated with Singapore as an independent country when it became independent, right? Whereby you have Asian women who basically hangs around areas whereby there are Caucasian men, right? In hopes that they pick up a Caucasian man, and they would eventually maybe not just have fling, but perhaps have a permanent partner or a mate, right? Permanent partner or a mate itself. Now, so the Sarong Party Girl has been around for quite a while, right? But it really became popular in the 1990s when an Australian writer by the name of James Atchison, who was basically based in Singapore, or at least took his residence in Singapore for a while, wrote a series of parody books that made fun of the Sarong Party Girl. But that's where it really took off in the 1990s. The Sarong Party Girl was already around in the 70s or 80s, right? But seeing beyond the comedy or the humorous parodies of the Sarong Party Girl in Atchison's book, right, you can see why there have been criticism towards the Sarong Party Girl, right? The Sarong Party Girl itself, right? Now today, is the Sarong Party Girl still around? Yes, probably there is, but the heydays are gone. I believe the peak of the Sarong Party Girls are gone. And this could be also due, and I would say that this was also due to the increasing affluence of Singapore society, right? So you must remember, right? A Sarong Party Girl itself is really no different from all the examples I've talked about Sayonara or Miss Saigon or what you call The World of Susie Wong, these musical plays and all that. But these are based on an earlier time, right? Of, let's say, the 50s, 60s, or even 70s during the Vietnam War itself, in the case of Miss Saigon, right? Miss Saigon itself. Now, the Sarong Party Girl itself is basically based in Singapore, or at least a Singapore version. And this is where you can see where criticism of Sarong Party Girl to a certain extent is legitimate, or at least it warrants some attention to it. Now, the Sarong Party Girl, right, who basically dates a Caucasian or Western expatriate, right? What's so wrong about that? No, actually, there's nothing wrong about that, right? There's nothing wrong about that. what's so wrong about an Asian woman dating a Western man, all right? The issue is not so much as she dating a Western man, is the issue whereby she basically negates or looks down on Asian men, where she refuses to even date Asian men and just prefers the Caucasian or Western man, right? That is the goal that she has set, right? That has the goal that she has. That's where the criticism comes in, right? Sort of in many ways, it's sort of like a self-hatred for one's own culture, or a self-hatred for one's own origin. After all, that's where you come from in the Asian world, but you refuse to have anything to do in searching for a partner with your own community, but you seek only the outside world of the Asian man, of the Western man itself, right? Now, these cultural biases is sort of a kind of a mild version of self-loathing of one's own culture, could be also seen in what you call the Pinkerton syndrome, right? Now, I didn't mention about this, right? The main character in Madame Butterfly, the American character, he was Lieutenant Pinkerton, right? Now, what do I mean by the Pinkerton syndrome, right? Now, Pinkerton syndrome actually applies to a broader cultural biases for Westerners or Caucasian people, right? And now this probably was a result of many years of colonization. For example, for the last 200 years, at least in the modern history of the last 200 years, the Western world has always triumphed over the non-Western world since the 1800s right to the first half of the 20th century, right? It's only in recent times that you find that you have the rise of China or rise of the mini dragons like Singapore, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and also Japan, South and South Korea and all that, right? You see this trend is changing. So you can see where the preference by the Sarong Party Girl is a product of a colonial baggage of a different era, right? Colonial baggage of a different era itself. So this non-recognition of her own people, where she wouldn't even consider or look down on dating her own racial group, could also be seen in the Pinkerton syndrome. Now, let me explain the Pinkerton, what is it all about, right? The Pinkerton syndrome itself is basically a sort of cultural bias for Westerners, right? And as far as I know, in the Singapore context, there's only been one study, right? The study, and what is this study about? I believe this study was done by a group of researchers, right? And it was published in 2019, and it shows that just to give you the gist of the study itself, it shows that in employment, right? And employment opportunities in interviews, right? Strangely enough, or not strangely enough, right? The Caucasian candidate is often preferred over a local candidate, even if all qualifications are the same, or even if the Caucasian man or woman has lesser qualifications. So you can see why they call this a Pinkerton syndrome, because it's an extension of their Orientalist perception itself, right? The Orientalist bias itself. Now, this study also shows other examples. You can call it a kind of racism, right? Because this study also shows other examples of employment practices whereby it's not just between Caucasian men and Asian men, but even shows that there's also like racial prejudice towards different races within the Asian culture, that often a Malay man or a Malay candidate is even viewed with a bigger handicap compared to a Asian Chinese man who applies for the same job, right? Negative stereotypes of the Malay man and all that. So the Pinkerton syndrome is not just about what you call Caucasian and Asian, but even it goes further, at least in this study, it goes further to show the biases within the racial groups within the Asian community itself. Okay? Now, All right, now let me say this, right, to end this video itself, right? My own take on the Sarong Party Girl, even though it's probably a dying breed, right? It's simply this, right? The Sarong Party Girl is really a colonial baggage, right? A remnant from an earlier time, right? I can see why in the early stories of Madame Butterfly or Sayonara or, you know what I mean, South Pacific, or even the world of Suzy Wong and all, in virtually all cases, the Asian woman comes from a very impoverished country. So it's in our own self-interest, right, to find a mate from a Westerner who comes from a much more a developed world, and perhaps can provide her and her family a better life, right? So you can see the Sarong Party Girl is actually colonial left over from an earlier time, right? Its relevancy to modern Singapore is really very archaic, right? That's the reason why the Sarong Party Girl heydays are virtually over. I mean, it's over. It's definitely the peak days are over. It's dying, right? Especially within today's context, when the average Singapore girl has all the opportunities to further herself career-wise through education and all that, there's really no need to search for the expatriate or the Caucasian man to have a better life for yourself. Because in Singapore's context, Singapore is just as advanced, progressive, if not developed or more developed than a lot of Western societies. So the economic factor is really negated in the modern Sarong Party Girl itself. All right, so you can see why it's actually kind of irrelevant. And like I say, there's nothing wrong with dating Westerners. It's when you exclude your own local counterparts, where you will not even look at your own Asian men while you blindly follow in search of a Western Caucasian man. That, again, like I say, the root itself could be traced to an earlier time where the economic disparities were very huge between the East and the West. Okay, so anyway, that's just my take on the Sarong Party Girl and the origins of the Sarong Party Girl and the irrelevance of the Sarong Party Girl in the modern Singapore world. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and on that note, I'll say goodbye now. See you another time.